First of all, thanks a lot to the organizers for making this conference possible. I am really looking forward to all the other talks and discussion. Before I start my own talk, allow me to introduce myself a little bit. I am Karen and I am research assistant and PhD student working with Dina Emons at the Freie Universität Berlin. My PhD thesis is on teleology in Kant and in Hegel, so it comes kind of naturally that I also think about Hegel's thesis on the relation between mechanism and teleology, and especially on his claim that teleology is somehow supposed to be the truth of mechanism. So here's what I got. In the science of logic, we can find Hegel's investigation into the relationship between mechanism and teleology in the section of objectivity. Here, Hegel is primarily concerned with the role that these types of causality play in the constitution of objects. Note that I'm using the term causality in broad, non-Hegelian sense. The starting point of Hegel's investigation are objects constituted by mechanical relations. The end point of his investigation are objects constituted by propulsive relations. Now, I take Hegel to hold that in reality, mechanism obtains, and in reality, teleology obtains. So, there are causal mechanical processes, and there are propulsive processes, as well as there are mechanical objects and propulsive objects. On a superficial view, this does not seem to be a very controversial thesis. For in Hegel, the term teleology refers to the kind of causality by which the realization of a purpose is bound to intentionally acting subjects. According to this, purposes are initially represented subjectively in order to then be realized objectively. Now, hardly anyone would doubt that there are causal mechanical relations governing natural events, nor would anyone doubt that there are subjects who think and act according to purposes. More controversial, however, is the thesis with regard to the question of the exact relationship between mechanism and teleology. In contrast to, for example, Kant, according to Hegel, there are no two independent realms, the realm of nature and the realm of freedom, the former subject to causal mechanical relationships, the latter subject to purposes. For Hegel, there's only one realm in which there's both mechanism and teleology. And Hegel's claim is not only that there is one realm in which there is mechanism and teleology, but also that there's one realm in which teleology has also priority over mechanism. In Hegelian terminology, teleology is supposed to be the truth of mechanism. It is hard to understand what that really means. Now, it is tempting to choose the claim of the priority of teleology over mechanism as a justification for a reading according to which Hegel entertains a teleological view of reality and claims that reality unfolds in a propulsive way. Yet, I think one should treat the thesis of teleology as the truth of mechanism carefully. If one understands it in such a way that mechanical relations, for whatever reasons, always take place in favor of purposes, then the thesis that there is mechanism, which Hegel, in my opinion, clearly also supports, is at least very unclear. For Hegel's account of mechanism goes hand in hand with the idea that the world is a causally closed whole, and that mechanism is blind mechanism. So mechanical relations do not take place in favor of any purposes. In this sense, I think, large parts of Hegel's natural philosophy speak in favor of interpreting nature such that mechanical processes are not directed towards a goal but run blindly. They suggest an understanding of nature on purely mechanical grounds and as something that can be described mathematically. And this conflicts with the reading according to which Hegel advocates some kind of teleological view of reality, some kind of world teleology. Against this background, the question arises as to how Hegel can, on the one hand, defend the thesis of the existence of blind natural mechanism, and on the other, simultaneously hold on to the thesis that there is teleology and that teleology has priority over mechanism. My aim in this talk is to justify the priority of teleology without ontologically undermining mechanism. And in the following, I argue that Hegel considers mechanism and teleology to be compatible insofar as they refer to different aspects of object determination. I am going to argue that mechanical processes only determine these objects externally, yet presuppose these objects for their own appearance. Accordingly, in causal mechanical explanations, we can understand neither the specific form nor the nature of individual objects. In contrast, proposive relations individuate mechanical objects. So, I think that Hegel claims that the individuation of mechanical objects depends on teleology. And in my view, the priority of teleology over mechanism is grounded in this very idea. To justify these theses, I proceed as follows. In the first part of my talk, I elaborate on Hegel's view of the original philosophical problem between mechanism and teleology. Then, I work on pointing out the structure of mechanism that is relevant to my argumentative goal. Mechanical structures are essentially such structures that function according to the cause and effect principle, which is why I consider Hegel's analysis of the cause and effect relationship in the second part of my talk. In the third part of my talk, I disclose the conceptual relationship between cause and effect relations and mechanism. And in the fourth part of my talk, I point out the extent to which individual objects cannot be determined by mechanical structures, but only by teleology. The claim that there is mechanism and teleology needs explanation. One needs to explain to what extent both structures can actually apply to one reality. For mechanism and teleology are in opposition to one another insofar as the mechanistic claim that the world is causally mechanically closed does not seem to be compatible with the claim that a subject acting proposively can causally intervene in this mechanistic world. Let us examine the philosophical problem as Hegel presents it a little bit deeper. The kind of proposiveness that is subject of the teleology chapter is the one that first comes to mind when thinking of proposiveness, because we ourselves exhibit it consciously. It is a peculiarity of ourselves to think and act according to purposes. And we distinguish this type of causality from purely causal mechanical processes in which objects are determined by blind causal processes. Just as we also distinguish objects constituted by purely mechanical processes from objects constituted by purposes. For the latter ones are, in contrast to the first ones, expressions of our own purposes. They are objects that we have intentionally created according to our purposes, and they stand in further purposive connections insofar as they serve to fulfill further ends. Accordingly, when we perceive purposiveness in the world, we naturally attribute it to the actions of an intelligence. I quote, When there is the perception of a purposiveness, an intelligence is assumed as its author. Required for the purpose is thus the concept's own free, concrete existence. Teleology is above all contrasted with mechanism, in which determinateness posited in the object, being external, is one that gives no self-determination. According to Hegel, in the history of philosophy, these two different types of causality had led to a great discussion about, quote, whether the absolute essence of the world is to be conceived as blind mechanism or as an intelligence that determines itself in accordance with purposes. I think we can describe the problem as follows. On the one hand, if one admits that the world is a causally mechanically closed world, in which cause-effect chains run blindly, then it is not easy to see how purposive causality is possible in exactly the same world. The reality of purposive causality would undermine the thesis that the world is causally closed. On the other hand, if one admits that there be purposive causality in this world, then this seems to undermine the thesis of blind mechanism. Because in this case, the mechanically occurring processes would have to be such that they actually serve purposes. Granted this, however, they no longer seem to be able to be blind processes, but to have always been directed purposively, taking an intelligence as its author. Therefore, according to Hegel, in the history of philosophy, mechanism and teleology have been treated as opposites. Now, one could object that there is a difference in claiming that there are intentional subjects acting according to purposes, and in claiming that there is a kind of creator or God who created the world according to purposes. I pointed out that it is not easy to combine intentional acting subjects with the claim that there is mechanism. The historical debate Hegel refers to is about the possibility of a God intentionally creating the mechanistic world. However, note that Hegel's analysis of teleology is supposed to apply to all subjects acting purposively. The structures unfolded by Hegel's analysis of teleology apply also to a purposively acting God. So I think it does not make a difference if we refer to a God or to intentionally acting subjects when analyzing this kind of purposiveness. Now, Hegel thinks that only an investigation into the conceptual content of both terms can provide clarity of the structures of mechanism and teleology and their relation to each other. And he criticizes the fact that these philosophers, which he summarizes under the title former metaphysics, were unable to provide such a conceptual analysis. Instead, they would largely presuppose a worldview to which either one type of causality or the other fits. Hegel himself does not make a very direct reference to whom he exactly has in mind, but in his lectures on the history of philosophy, he includes under the term formal metaphysics philosophers such as Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, Newton, Leibniz, and Wolff. And in fact, Hegel's criticism of Descartes goes in the suggested direction. I quote in German now. Bei dieser Philosophie ist die denkende Behandlung des Empirischen vorherrschend. Auf eben diese Weise zeigen sich die Philosophien dieser Zeit an. Die Philosophie hatte bei Descartes und anderen noch die unbestimmtere Bedeutung, durchs Denken, Nachdenken, Resonieren zu erkennen. Es ist somit das, was jetzt philosophisches Erkennen und was sonst wissenschaftliches Erkennen heißt, nicht geschieden. Es rechnete sich also damals alle menschliche Wissenschaft zum Philosophieren. Und bei Descartes Metaphysik sahen wir das ganz empirische Resonieren aus Gründen, aus Erfahrungen, Tatsachen, Erscheinungen auf naivste Weise eintreten. Und bei Cartesius war ferner das Prinzip Denken, aber dieses Denken ist noch abstrakt und einfach. Das Konkrete steht noch drüben auf der anderen Seite und konkreterem Inhalt erhielt dieses Denken erst aus der Erfahrung. Das Bedürfnis, das Bestimmte aus dem Denken zu entwickeln, war noch nicht vorhanden. So, according to Hegel, Descartes had failed to examine the conceptual content of the concepts he used in order to clarify their relationship. Instead, as Hegel puts it, Descartes argued empirically, i.e., he generalized certain knowledge gained from the empirical science emerging at that time, in such a way that they form a closed mechanistic system. Then Descartes contrasted this reality with another reality determined by purposes. Hegel is now of the opinion that these two spheres, completely independent of one another, cannot be adequately justified because of the structural relations they are subject to. For if one examines the conceptual content of mechanism and purposiveness, it turns out that both relate to each other in an interdependent way. Formal metaphysics failed to examine the conceptual content of the terms mechanism and teleology, and thus they failed to examine their conceptual relationship to one another, which, according to Hegel, is essential for an appropriate understanding of the relation between both kinds of causality. Now, an investigation of the content of both concepts shows not only that both kinds of causality can exist in one world without reducing one to the other, but it also shows that both kinds of causality exist in such a way that one deserves priority over the other. I quote, "If mechanism and teleology stand opposed to each other, then by the very fact they cannot be taken as indifferent concepts, as if each were by itself a correct concept and has as much validity as the other, but the only question being where the one or the other may apply. But since they do stand opposed, the necessary first question is, which of the two concepts is the true one? But proposed connection has proved to be the truth of mechanism. Correspondingly, both points must be considered when investigating the structures of reality, and Hegel intends to do this in the objectivity section of the Science of Logic. Let's turn to this investigation now. Mechanism essentially consists of cause-effect processes. Furthermore, Hegel calls mechanism to be the truth of cause and effect processes. Therefore, I think it is important to work out the characteristics of the causality of cause and effect processes first. I am drawing on the section on causality in the logic of essence in order to do this. And I frequently use the abbreviation efficient causality when referring to cause-effect relations. In the section on causality, on the one hand, cause-effect relations are characterized by being external to the object on which they take place. Efficient causality consists in the transmission of a content from an object to another object. The content remains external to the object. We will see that this externality described in cause-effect relations also obtains in mechanism. On the other hand, Hegel argues that the relation considered in the causality chapter only thematizes isolated cause-effect relations as a subject matter of investigation. However, cause-effect relations are embedded in a larger inferential context that only becomes explicit through the concept of mechanism. Both points need to be explained in more detail, as I will do shortly. Hegel describes the relation that characterizes the cause-effect process as a transition in which a cause ceases to be a cause as soon as its effect has occurred. To be a cause is essentially to pass into the effect and to disappear in it. And according to Hegel, the disappearance of cause into effect is a consequence of the fact that the cause-effect relation is only a formal relation that consists of content that does not change while the cause-effect process takes place. That which is the cause is also the effect. Hegel uses the following example to illustrate this. Rain causes the wetness of the street. The wetness of the street is nothing other than the wetness of the rain. So rain is the cause of the wetness, which is its effect. That means rain functions only as cause insofar as it has an effect that sublates the cause, while the content of the cause-effect relation remains the same. The wetness in the air caused by the rain transforms into the wetness on the streets. The effect is an expression of the cause, but in such a way that the cause is considered to have disappeared. For the rain which falls on the street ceases to be the cause as soon as it turns into the effect, namely, as soon as it becomes the wetness on the street. The nature of the content, subject to cause-effect processes, does not change through these processes. Now, it is not easy to see how this thesis could hold for all causal relations happening in the world. Take, for example, a stone breaking a window. One might say that in this example, the stone is the cause and the breaking of the window is the effect. Thus, cause and effect seem to have a different content. However, it depends on what one really takes as cause and as effect. For, according to Hegel, it is not the stone that is the cause, but the propulsive force that is transmitted to another object, making the other object break. And with respect to that propulsive force, it is the same quantum of that propulsive force which the propulsive force contains that is transmitted to the other body into which the stone collides. Quote, if the movement of a body is considered as effect, the cause of this effect is then a propulsive force. But it is the same quantum of movement which is present before and after the propulsion. The same concrete existence which the propulsive body contained and which it communicated to the one propelled. And what is communicated is lost in equal measure. That is, to say that the breaking of the window pane is the effect of the stone breaking the window actually means that there was a cause-effect relation happening which consists in the transmission of a propulsive force. And if we take this thesis about causal relations for granted, then in processes subject to efficient causality, the content that is subject to causal relations does not change. It is not affected at all. Hence, causal relations are external to the objects they determine. This implies that efficient causality does not tell us anything about the nature of the objects on which it is carried out. It is true that the stone is subject to relations of cause and effect, but these relations tell us nothing about what a stone is. That means that breaking a window pane is not essential to a stone being a stone. It is also true that the window pane has the disposition of being fragile, but this disposition cannot be understood as the effect of a propulsive force. In our example, the cause-effect processes do not explain why window panes are fragile. As Hegel puts it, the object is, with respect to cause-effect relations, quote, an immediate, concrete existence, end of quote. In contrast, it is inherent to cause-effect relations to have, quote, their substrate, that is, their essential existence, end of quote, in an external object, based on the example just brought up in the stone. The explanations given so far relate only to individual and, in this sense, isolated cause-effect relations. This type of explanation of an event is subject to Hegel's criticism, insofar as it cannot provide an adequate explanation of the event. On the one hand, an event is never caused monocausally. As it has already been made clear, we cannot explain the breaking of the window simply by the impact of one object to another. Rather, we have to include other factors, such as, in this case, for example, the nature of the window pane, or, for example, the intention of a subject to break the window pane by throwing the stone. On the other hand, a certain cause-effect relation is itself the product of a previous one. The disappearance of the cause into the effect also means that each cause was in turn the effect of another cause. In fact, any cause-effect relation is itself part of a chain of cause-effect relations. The individual cause considered in the causal relation is itself the effect of another cause. It presupposes there being another cause of which it is the effect. The object, that which communicates the propulsive force to another object, cannot in the strict sense be identified as the cause. This is not only because the propulsive force counts as actual force according to Hegel, and not to the object, i.e. the stone, but also because the propulsive force is not grounded in the object that carries it on. Rather, the propulsive force has already been imposed, or in Hegelian terms communicated, to this object and is therefore always just the effect on the object. Note that Hegel's thesis is not, as one might think at first, that a singular cause cannot itself actually be the cause of a certain event, because the entire chain of cause-effect relations has to be included in an explanation of the event. In the given example, the propulsive force can be identified as the cause, even if the event itself remains underdetermined. Rather, Hegel's argument consists in showing that no object can itself be an originative or a first cause. Being a cause is not, as Hegel puts it, an originary determination of an object, even though it appears to be in isolated cause-effect relations. Being a cause is something that happens to the object. The object is not the origin of cause-effect relations, but only the carrier of them. Let's turn to the third part of my talk, which is about the structure of mechanisms. In the chapter on mechanism, this non-ordinary character of acting objects becomes explicit. This character defines mechanical relations. For the main feature of mechanisms is that the objects subject to mechanism serve as what I call carrier objects. Mechanism consists in the transmission and communication of, for example, pressure and impact forces. Without this transmission and communication of forces, and without objects functioning as carrier objects, there would be no mechanism. According to Hegel, the spread of heat in the atmosphere represents such a mechanical process. In his philosophy of nature, Hegel states that warmth has an expanding character. It therefore consists in the communication of attractive, i.e. an attracting force among particles or carrier objects, which does not tear the particles apart, but instead brings them into a permanent connection, and thereby liquefies them. I ignore how this interpretation of heat must be understood specifically, and to what extent it can be brought into harmony with the modern view of the expansion of heat. For my purposes, this example serves to clarify that heat presupposes the existence of particles or carrier objects for its own existence. Since, according to Hegel, heat essentially consists in the transfer of forces. In this sense, Hegel also opposes to the idea, quite common in his time, of the existence of something like a warm substance. This idea presupposes, quote, the material independence of warmth, end of quote. There is no such a thing as a warm substance, since according to Hegel's account, it is substantial for warmth to spread to already existing carrier objects. It is characteristic of warmth that it consists in a transfer of forces that is suffered by objects and thus requires the existence of these carrier objects than rather being itself one. The example shows that in mechanism the two characteristics that are essential to cause-effect relations are these characteristics that produce mechanism. Mechanical objects are units composed of carrier objects that are held together by a causal interaction of these carrier objects. The non-originary character, the positing of an object by another object, i.e., the fact that each object was only the effect of a previous causal relation and not the initial cause of a new causal relation, makes mechanism possible in the first place. Therefore, Hegel describes mechanism as the truth of efficient causality. I quote, hence, insofar as the object is posited in the form of subjective unity as efficient cause, this no longer counts as originary determination, but as something mediated. The active object has this determination, but as something mediated. The active object has this determination only by means of another object. Mechanism, since it belongs to the sphere of the concept, has posited within it, which proved to be the truth of the relation of causality, namely, that the cause, which is supposed to be something existing in and for itself, is in fact, effect just as well positedness. In mechanism, therefore, the originary causality of the object is immediately a non-originariness. The object is indifferent to this determination attributed to it. That it is a cause is therefore accidental to it. In this sense, mechanism is an expression of such a mediated relation of cause-effect relations, and thus it represents explicitly the inferential relations at work in efficient causality. This implies that the externality described in efficient causality also applies to mechanism. The carrier objects remain presuppositions. They are themselves not constituted by the causal relations they are subject to. The essential nature of these carrier objects is neither explained by their causal interaction, nor does it change as a result of their causal interaction. This immutability of the nature of the carrier objects through mechanical forces is what Hegel describes as their indifference of the objects to one another. Mechanical relations are carried out on all spatial temporal carrier objects, but they do not change the nature of these objects. Moreover, I think, even if Hegel does not mention Kant's account of mechanism explicitly, it is easy to see that Hegel takes up central aspects of the Kantian account. For, according to Kant, a mechanical whole is one in which the parts constitute a whole, and the parts are held together to form a whole by certain forces. According to Kant's account of mechanism, the properties of the parts do not change by their being parts of a mechanical whole, nor do they change when falling apart again. I think this is what Hegel means by calling them indifferent to each other. The parts of a mechanical whole are given independently of this whole and are only related to one another through the external forces carried out by efficient causality. For Hegel, the externality that is inscribed in mechanism has the consequence that objects held together by mechanical forces are only composition, mixture, aggregate. Quote, this is what constitutes the character of mechanism, namely, whatever the connection that obtains between things combined, the connection remains alien to them. That does not affect their nature, and even when a reflective semblance of unity is associated with it, the connection remains nothing more than a composition, mixture, aggregate. End of quote. To be part of a mechanical whole is therefore coincidental for the carrier object. The same contingency that obtains with regard to the carrier objects in individual, isolated cause-effect relations is also maintained in mechanism. Just as it coincidentally happens that the stone functions as a transmitter of the propulsive force, a metal ball or a branch could just as well have served as such a transmitter, so the carrier objects in mechanism also just coincidentally transmit mechanical forces. According to Hegel, aggregates are characterized by the fact that the nature of the supporting objects of the aggregate is not changed substantially if they form a unit through the mechanical forces that we call aggregate. If an aggregate falls apart, the unit, i.e., the mechanical object described in this way, has disappeared, but the nature of the carrier objects that made up this unit does not change. Due to this externality, which unifies carrier objects to a mechanical object, quote, the mechanical object is as such an object only as product, for what it is only by virtue of the mediation of another in it. It is as product that it thus is what it was supposed to be in and for itself, a composite, a mixture, a certain arrangement of parts, in general such that its determinateness is not self-determination, but something positive. End of quote. Let's turn to the next part of my talk, which is on the possibility of mechanical objects. The train of thought in the last two parts shows that the cause-effect relations, which are essential for mechanical conditions, require carrier objects for their own occurrence. The nature of these carrier objects is only externally determined by mechanical processes. Accordingly, mechanism leaves aspects of reality underdetermined. These carrier objects are themselves mechanical objects, objects that are also held together by mechanical forces. However, in the mechanical explanation of these carrier objects, one has to assume, again, carrier objects. If these are in turn understood as mechanical objects, we assume carrier objects on a further level. Due to the structure inherent to mechanism, we will not arrive at an endpoint here, but rather enter an infinite regress based on the previous analysis of mechanism. Being a cause is not an original determination of a mechanical object, because the object is always also the product of mechanical relations. This also means that every supposedly complete explanation of the constitution of an object based on mechanism only turns out to be an arbitrary break in the chain of explanation. Quote, for this reason, determinism is itself so indeterminate as to be bound to an infinite progression. It can halt at will anywhere, and be satisfied there, because the object to which it has progressed, being a formal totality, is shut up within itself and indifferent to its being determined by another. For this reason, to explain the determination of an object, and to this end, to extend the representation of it beyond it, is only an empty word, for there is no self-determination in the other object to which the explanation has been extended. End of quote. In cause-effect relations, the object is never the originant, but merely the carrier of these relations. As soon as we consider an explanation based on mechanism to be the most fundamental one, on which all other cause-effect relations are based, we do not explain to what extent the corresponding most fundamental object is actually the origin of the cause-effect relation. Instead, we only postulate it. This postulation, according to Hegel, is triggered because the carrier objects are indifferent to their causal mechanical determinations, and in this respect, they do not automatically refer to further causal mechanical determinations for their own determination. However, on the basis of pure mechanism alone, nothing remains but an empty word, since there is no object being an original cause. We try to give an explanation that is blocked due to the structure of mechanism. As already emphasized when discussing efficient causality, this does not mean that explanations based on causal mechanical structures become inadequate as De Vries claims, for example. Mechanical explanations are explanations of the corresponding event. They just do not completely determine the event. Mechanical explanations do not determine all aspects of such an event. The argument leads to the second one. It clarifies that on the basis of mechanical structures alone, it is unclear what actually counts as an individual mechanical object. Or, as Stern puts it, quote, not only is the structure of the object itself a merely external unity, Mechanics also views the relation between objects as equally external, so that they form an unqualified plurality. End of quote. We said that a mechanical object should be one that is held together by external mechanical forces such as pressure and impact. On the basis of mechanism, the parts that are put together to form such an object are themselves objects that are held together again by further parts. And in fact, Hegel himself called the parts brought together in mechanical objects by mechanical forces objects. Against this background, it is unclear what actually counts as a single object, i.e. the individuation conditions of mechanical objects are unclear on the basis of mechanism alone. Now, in an essay concerned with the idea of life, Lindqvist emphasizes a point made by Hegel which can help clarify the difficulty just described here. As Lindqvist points out, Hegel understands matter to be both discrete and continuous. Lindqvist refers to a relevant passage in paragraph 289 of Hegel's Natural Philosophy. There, Hegel writes, quote, "Whenever the question of material parts arises, one should not think of them as atoms or molecules, i.e. as separated and self-subsistent, but merely quantitatively or contingently distinguished, so that their continuity is essentially inseparable from their distinctness." End of quote. That which is a material object and that which has to be regarded as part of a material object is, according to Lindqvist, not given by the basic structure of matter, but it is dependent on our choosing way of counting them. Thinking subjects are those who determine what a part of material object is and what a material object is, and thus who individualize material objects as such. Note that on my reading, this does not mean that mechanical objects are only some kind of constructions of subjects acting purposively. Rather, it does mean that the ontological structure of matter is such that it allows for such a kind of determination without ceasing to be inherently the structure of matter. The determination of mechanical objects by these subjects corresponds to the structure of matter. This thought is helpful for my own purposes, insofar as the basic structure of matter, according to Hegel, is based on the basic structure of mechanism. The mechanical forces of repulsion and attraction are constitutive for the creation of matter. The essential determinations of matter are grounded in mechanism. Now, one result of the discussion of mechanism is that it is undetermined what counts as the individual mechanical object, because the carrier objects are themselves mechanical objects. They can stand in one particular mechanical unit as in another. It is external to them to be parts of a mechanical object, just as it is external to them to be mechanical objects themselves. On the basis of mechanism alone, it is not clear what constitutes an individual mechanical object. So we can conclude what is in each case a mechanical object is also with respect to mechanism dependent on what thinking subjects determine as mechanical objects in, for example, experiments. The reality of individual mechanical objects is therefore dependent on teleological structures. Individual mechanical objects are ontologically dependent on the teleological access to them. And since the reality of individual mechanical objects depends on the positing of purposes, Hegel can claim teleology to be the truth of mechanism. It is worth noting that this does not mean that there are no mechanical objects, just as this does not mean that mechanical objects are teleological objects, that means artifacts. The thesis advocated here with Hegel is that it is the structure of mechanism itself that allows for the individuation of mechanical objects through teleology. As Hegel puts it, quote, "Thus, mechanical or chemical technique, because of its character of being externally determined, naturally offers itself to the connection of purpose." End of quote. Let us finally conclude. I argued that the externality thesis applies to efficient causality and to mechanism. They do not determine objects sufficiently. Rather, they presuppose objects through which they can be carried out. This led to the further claim that on the basis of mechanism alone, there are no individual objects. As we have seen, only teleology individuates mechanical objects. I think the advantage of the reading I proposed here lies in the fact that on the one hand my reading can show the compatibility of mechanism and teleology by demonstrating that each form of causality determines a different aspect of reality. And on the other hand, it can justify the priority of teleology without ontologically undermining mechanism by the very fact that it is the structure of mechanism itself that corresponds to the objects individuated by subjects. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your comments and to the discussion. Bye.